Good afternoon, ladies and gents. This fine afternoon, we're going to be talking on the NARUC National Council, Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council, Brown Bag broadcast about how things are going with RGGI, and as the only active multi-state greenhouse gas control program, what does that mean if we are interested in lessons learned for other multi-state greenhouse gas control programs that might be responsive to the soon to be released Clean Power Plan. This is Miles Keogh. I'm the Director of Grants and Research here at NARUC, and every week we try and bring you something exciting and spicy in the world of electricity policy topics. I hope you brought your lunch. Today's going to be a good one. Before I get started, three housekeeping announcements. One is that in order to maintain audio purity in a world of chaos, we do have all the participants on mute, but that doesn't mean that we don't want you to be active participants. If you have a question, or if you want me to interrupt something, or if you need something clarifying to be raised, please use the questions function that's over there on the right-hand side of your screen that's part of the webcast software, and I'll be eyeing that like a hawk and moving as many questions as we possibly can in the next hour out to our speakers. Secondly, as always, NARUC's electricity policy efforts in this space and our work with the National Council on Electricity Policy and the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council is supported with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy. So if you see our friends from the U.S. DOE, do give them a high five of thanks and appreciation. We couldn't do this without them. With that, we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to just steer us right into what we're doing. Today we're joined by two folks. One is Paul Hibbard from the Analysis Group. Paul was the chair at the Massachusetts Commission a little while back, and is one of the folks who was a designer of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is some work that's been done in the northeastern states. Numbers vary, but between 7 and 9 states, depending on where we are in our program timeline. These states got together with an MOU in 2005 and moved towards a program that enabled interstate cooperation and trading towards a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector. Since leaving the Massachusetts Commission, Paul's been an observer and an analyst who's worked on looking at how the greenhouse gas program has been going with RGGI, and not at the direction of RGGI, but independently has done, the analysis group has done some analysis of how things have gone. We'll be joined after Paul gives us a quick tour of the latest data that's come in by Jonas Monist. Jonas is down at Duke University with the Nicholas Institute, and this is not his first rodeo talking with us. Nicholas has been talking about what are some of the ways that states can engage with the Clean Power Plan on an individual state, on a multi-state basis. What are some of the landmines that are out there, things that work and things that don't work? And their work has largely focused on southeastern and midwestern states. And so I asked Jonas to come along to talk a little bit about how does what RGGI is working on look like and look different than some of the multi-state approaches that are in the marketplace of ideas in the Southeast in particular, but in the Midwest and the rest of the country as well. And are there lessons that we can draw for states that are interested in doing a multi-state compliance program that's not RGGI, that is in another region, and for states who are interested in understanding the implications of other states and regions going in? In other words, if your neighbors are all joining some sort of a multi-state arrangement, what does that mean for you as a non-participant or as a maybe participant? What are some of the questions we can be asking about the implications of these things? So I think this is going to be really fun. Questions are welcome. Like I said, I'm going to be curating them along the side here, and I'll make sure that they're reflected into our discussion. With that, let me start by saying, Paul, are you there?
I am.
Paul, let me turn things over to you. please give us a view of what the analysis group's economic impacts assessment from RGGI was.
Sure. Thanks, Miles, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending upon where you are. It is a pleasure to speak to you all about this. I know many of you are wrestling with some difficult issues, or will be over the next months or years related to the Clean Power Plan. So the timing of this webinar, of course, is extremely timely. And Miles, I don't know how you managed to look into the crystal ball and figure that this would be a good topic just a few days before EPA releases its final rule, but very good timing indeed. You can flip ahead to the next slide. I'll go through this very quickly. This is just some background on it. We did a study of the RGGI program's past 3 years. RGGI has actually been in force for 6 years. It began in its first auction of allowances was in late 2008. It had a compliance period of 3 years, meaning after each 3-year compliance period, sources affected by the program have to demonstrate they're in compliance. We looked at the second compliance period in this study, 2012, 13, and 14. This follows on a similar study we did for the first compliance period, and one of the things we tried to do is do the analysis in this one in a way that was consistent methodologically with the first one, so that we could think not only about what has happened with the past 3 years of implementation, but ultimately what does the full 6 years of this multi-state program in the Northeast mean from both economic perspectives but also administrative perspectives, and what are the implications for states that may want to think about going down the path of multi-state or mass-based compliance with the Clean Power Plan. It's a foundation-supported study, and we had a number of reviewers that have spent most of their lives for the past several years looking into both RGGI and Clean Power Plan type issues, and that were very helpful. Next slide, Miles. So it's helpful at the outset, I think, to talk about what the study is not. There have been a number of studies leading up to implementation of the RGGI program back prior to 2009, and also during implementation of the program, including as part of the most recent full top-to-bottom review by the RGGI states of the program, which happened in 2012, that look at a whole different host of factors, including what the carbon reduction and potential ancillary environmental benefits might be of the RGGI program, whether or not the program was actually needed, and an assessment of what the cap level should be in consideration of industry and economic factors and environmental objectives. A number of studies have forecasted future participation and what the effectiveness or the results might be based upon forecasts going forward, and others have looked at the carbon market itself, the market for the sale, purchase and sale of allowances, and thought about whether or not that is a competitive market, or if there is something funky going on that can ultimately affect the price or the fluidity in the market. We didn't do any of those things. Our study scope is pretty limited, pretty narrow to the issue of money, essentially. We looked at, it's an economic study. It all starts with the actual collection of revenues by the RGGI states associated with them selling allowance, and through the auctions, selling allowances, in the open trading of allowances. We follow the money both in terms of the effect that the allowance retirement obligation has on power plant owners in the RGGI states. And I should note, for all of you that are not aware, all of the RGGI states are within competitive wholesale power markets, New England, New York, and PJM. So we follow the impact on the electric sector, and then we follow the use of the revenues and the impact on the electric sector through a general economic model, and we measure the results. The idea being, back when RGGI was being formed and when it was first implemented, there was a lot of angst amongst, particularly amongst the Public Utility Commission community, but also with respect to the consumer organizations and industrial organizations about what the cost impact would be from an electric perspective, but also what the impact on the economy might be. At the time of the original implementation, the program developers had a number of cost control mechanisms built into it, and those still exist at this point in time. But nevertheless, there was concern and a lot of worry about what the economic impact will be, and that's essentially what we tried to calculate in our study. Next slide, Miles. So the bottom line results I'll talk to you about throughout this presentation, and I'll go through this one quickly because I mentioned each of these going forward. We looked at it with respect to the implementation of the program in these 3 years. We found that there are net positive economic impacts for the entire region and for each RGGI state. Essentially, it involves the spending of the approximately $1 billion in revenues over this period. Translates to approximately $1.3 billion in net economic value added. And that results from various ways in which the auction proceeds are used by the states. The states have the freedom to really do anything they want with their auction revenues. Ultimately, the biggest effect from an electricity cost and an economic perspective is the reinvestment of those dollars in energy efficiency within the states. But economic value is created in lots of ways by the way the states have used the money to meet various public policy goals. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about, based upon looking at the experience in the Northeast with RGGI, are there information or lessons for other states to the extent states are interested in pursuing either a multi-state program regardless of the design or a mass-based program, some sort of a cap-and-trade program. Next slide, Miles. Oh, next one. So this summarizes the modeling effort that we did, and it looks a little confusing at first. I'll spend a couple of minutes on this just because it really is only one slide that is showing you our method. Up at the top, you see a box called RGGI auctions. We look at the auction revenues collected by RGGI in each quarter. So 4 times a year, RGGI auctions allowances, 1/4 of the annual allowances, roughly. And affected entities, or those that want to participate in the market, purchase them. That ultimately sets a price for allowances in that quarter. And what we do is we look over time at the collection of those revenues and how the revenues are spent, as well as how it affects the electric sector. So if you follow the green line from that, the auction revenues are collected by states, and with some lag period, they spend the states on various things like education, direct bill assistance, program administration, greenhouse gas mitigation measures. The states really have this huge panoply of different ways they use the RGGI funds, and all of them are focused on achieving various policy objectives of the individual states. But the vast majority of it is spent on energy efficiency and renewables. So in the one sense, we look at the way the states collect and spend the money in the economy, and that has sort of a direct macroeconomic impact, and we're studying that within the right side box here, the in-plan macroeconomic model. But we realize that if we don't account for how the use of the RGGI proceeds affects what goes on in the electric sector in these 3 regions, then we're missing out on what may be the most important part of the economic puzzle, which is the effect it has on the amount of money consumers have to spend and the amount of money that power plant owners spend to comply with the program. So you see those green lines sweep back around. We look at the way the states spend the money on energy efficiency and renewables and model that in the production cost model, ProMod. We model it over a period that includes the 3 years of program implementation, but we also try to capture the long-run effects of those investments. We truncated it all at 10 years after the compliance period, and some of these investments, renewables and some of the energy efficiency programs, continue to generate impacts beyond that period. But we just want to take a snapshot, implement the program for 3 years, and capture at least 10 years of effects associated with those investments. Following from the RGGI auction box up above, if you follow the red line, obviously the entities affected by the program have to purchase carbon dioxide allowances. And in all of these regions, those resources include the essentially the opportunity cost of those allowances and the price they're offering to supply energy in these competitive markets. We do this on a quarterly basis. Essentially, every auction we identify the price in that auction as being the opportunity of the cost of the allowances within that quarter, and we do that for every quarter of the 3-year period we're looking at. So that has an impact in increasing electricity prices. Whenever those affected units are on the margin, it increases electricity prices. The owners of the resources collect their costs associated with the program through that, because they're always collecting what that marginal cost for an allowance is. But you'll see that over time, the reinvestment in efficiency and renewables tends to actually reduce sales by generators over time, and that over the period of the forecast period is a negative impact from an economic standpoint. The other thing is the initial increase in cost associated with the increased prices is a negative impact, because consumers are spending more on electricity, have less to spend in the economy, but at the same time, over time, as energy efficiency measures take hold, that has the opposite effect. Over the long run, it tends to offset the initial increase. So at the bottom of the ProMod box there is just reflecting both the negative effects for some entities in the electric sector associated with the program and the positive effects as consumers spend less on energy over time. We roll those pieces into the macroeconomic model along with the impact of the direct investments. Next slide. Oh, you click a few times here. There we go. So ultimately, we follow the money, and I know that many of you are familiar with these details, but each state's, as I mentioned, the states auction, each quarter the states auction off the allowances, generators purchase them, and ultimately we're following that and following the specific ways the state spends the money and the impact on consumers. One important thing I just want to note on this slide before moving forward is that and this is an important thing that the RGGI states realized early on and considered in program design, is that ultimately the impact on the electric sector is the same whether the states decided to give the allowances to the affected units or to do what they all ended up doing, which is holding those allowances and auctioning them and collecting the revenues and using them for public policy purposes. Either way, the value of generation that leads to the emission of a ton is an opportunity cost for the generator, and they include the same price in their offer to sell electricity in these markets, and then ultimately the hourly clearing price reflects those costs. Next slide, Miles. This is just laying out the method that we used, focused specifically in this case on ProMod. The only thing I want to mention from this is the way we structured this is we looked at the way the world exists as a result of RGGI being implemented. And what we had to create was a counterfactual where we said, if RGGI had not existed, what investments in efficiency and renewables and other direct investments in the economy would not have occurred? And so our counterfactual is, it's a little bit backwards. It's the world with the program as it exists, and then we strip out the effect of the program and we rerun the model, and then we compare the differences. Next slide. And just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here in terms of dollars, the blue bar on the right that's higher than all the others is the total for all the RGGI states. In the top bar chart, that's the first compliance period, 2009 through 2011. In the bottom bar chart, that's the second compliance period, the one that we studied in this report. I put them both up here in part because it's just interesting to note that over the course of the two compliance periods, the amounts collected by the state are approximately the same, approximately $1 billion. And part of that is because when the states initially set the program cap back in 2007, 2008, when they were negotiating it, the world was a very different place. And following that, as the program started to take hold, the economy was crashing, and shale gas was becoming an important influence on natural gas prices in these regions, and that's a big influence on how the power sector evolves. And so what you see here is that over time, the price of the allowances followed the fact that these other economic and underlying fuel price influences tended to mean that the carbon reductions were going down with or without the RGGI program. So the RGGI allowance prices dropped to the floor, and you can see them declining from 2009 to 10 and 11. The revenues declining. Then we get to the second compliance period where the states have already undergone a full review, and they reduced the cap so that in 2013 a lower cap took effect. That meant there were fewer allowances, but the price of those allowances shot up. So it's almost by coincidence that over the two compliance periods, very different factors influencing allowance price and the number of allowances were at play. But in both compliance periods, it represents about $1 billion for the states to spend on their various programs. And the way they spent it, now next slide, Miles. The way they spent it has a big impact on the economic impacts within the states. This lays out for each of the regions and for RGGI as a whole how the money was used. The important things to note here are in the upper left-hand pie chart for all RGGI states. You can see in the green about 60% is spent on energy efficiency, and this is in the 2012 to 2014 period. About 13% is spent on direct bill assistance, 12% on various greenhouse gas programs and program administration, and about 15% focused on renewable energy investment type programs. How that breaks down by region is significant. New England, 80% is spent on energy efficiency, whereas if you look at the RGGI states in PJM, it's a very different set of public policy goals that were implemented. Still, about a third is spent on energy efficiency and another 15% or 25% on greenhouse gas programs and renewables. But 40% goes back to the customers in the form of direct bill assistance, and with something of a focus on assisting residential and low-income customers there. So very important policy objectives for the use of the money, but they differ significantly across the states, and that has an effect on the economic impacts. Jump to the next slide, Miles.
Hey, just before we jump into that a sec, Paul, I got a question in about whether the pie charts here reflect the question of some of the money that went into the general funds of some of these states, and I wonder if you just take a sec to touch on that.
So Miles, the question is, what is the thinking that went into the way the states used the money?
No, just, you know, these pie charts don't show funds that got skimmed into general funds in different states, or do they?
Yes, they do. I mean, this represents the split of all of the money. And so when you see, I believe, and I can look back at this to confirm it, that the purple category, greenhouse gas programs and program administration, would reflect the dollars that would have been used for to address any fiscal issues or fiscal objectives of the individual states. So that's where the bucket should be. We just didn't want to have 18 different categories and colors on these.
Got it. Carry on. Oh, let me take you to the next slide so that you can actually carry on.
Sure. So the summary of the economic impacts, and then I'll move into discussing our observations based on the analysis. Again, about $1 billion in auction proceeds led to about $1.3 billion in economic value added. Consumers end up over the modeling period saving approximately $500 million, and the revenues, because of the suppressed demand and to some extent in the later years lower prices for power, power plant owners earn about $500 million less than they would have without RGGI. An interesting thing for the Northeast that is not necessarily something that translates to the other regions of the country is that because these states in the Northeast have basically zero indigenous fossil fuels produced in those states, all of the money that's spent for generation, a big portion of the money spent for generation from coal, oil, and natural gas facilities comes from outside of the states, and that's money spending by the electric sector that flows outside these states. By the effect of the program, reducing the total amount of generation from fossil fuel producers, that amounts to about $1.3 billion less in the spending on electric that goes out of the region, and that also has some economic impacts. Along with this economic activity, there are about 14,000 job years created. It's not 14,000 total jobs, it's job years. So think of it as 1,400 jobs each for 10 years or 14,000 jobs for 1 year. The thing to note about this, it's in isolation, you don't quite get this, but the thing that I like to point out is that RGGI was implemented because the governors in the states agreed they wanted to do something about climate. It's not an economic stimulus package by any means. It was not expected to be. In these numbers, when you look at them, they're relatively small compared to the economies and the electric spend in these states. So the point here isn't that, whoa, this is a great way to stimulate the economy. It's much more just sort of thinking about, on the margin, is this good for the economy, bad for the economy, or maybe neither, and certainly depends upon what's happening within each compliance period. But our findings here, I just wanted to make sure that that was put in context. Next slide, Miles. So there's just a few slides left, and I realize I'm going longer than I should have here, so I'll try to get through them quickly, and then we can get to Jonas and then to questions. Just some observations about this. It's the first multi-state program voluntarily adopted by states to control carbon. An important factor here is that the states have, and I'll harp on this a bit, when we look back over 6 years of implementation and the 4 or 5 years of design preceding this, while the states retained full implementation authority throughout, they really have worked together extremely well and cooperatively in designing the program and designing it based upon fundamental economic principles in a way that made sense from cost and efficiency perspectives, in setting what the cap was and allocating allowable emissions to states. You can imagine the biggest fear among states would be, I can't possibly agree with my neighbors on either what the cap should be or what portion of that cap in the associated revenue should come to my state. That the RGGI states, they did it roughly based upon historical emissions, but then there was a lot of horse trading. It was a difficult negotiation, but ultimately they came to that agreement and identified a common method of moving the allowances into the market. Now, any state could have chosen to just give away the allowances I mentioned, but they all, in the end, ended up auctioning them through a single common regional mechanism that ultimately sets the same price of carbon for 3 different wholesale power markets. They've done a great job sharing the governance of the program and making all decisions more or less through unanimous agreement amongst the different states. And then the other thing is that it's been a seamless part of the wholesale power markets in this region. The system operators are blind, essentially, to this program being implemented. If they were to look behind the offers from power generators, they would recognize for some of them the generators are assuming a variable cost associated with the opportunity cost of the allowances. But other than that, the systems have operated seamlessly and reliably, and from the system operator's perspective, it's all behind the scenes. They don't have to do anything, they don't have to account for it, and they don't even need to understand that it's happening. Next slide. How the states, I'll go through this quick because I've already mentioned most of this. The individual decisions by the states to actually auction the allowances was important from the standpoint of economic impact and achieving public policy goals. The states really could have given the allowances away. It ultimately would have been a windfall for the power generators because, as I mentioned, either way, they put the same price into their offers to sell power and get the same revenues for operating. So actually giving the allowances to them would have represented a windfall for those generators. But the decision by the states to say we're going to transfer that right to power plant owners at a cost so that we retain the value of that for the public and implement it in various public policy programs was a very important decision to be made by the states. Next slide, Miles. And then how the states use those funds. There must be hundreds of different programs when you look across all the RGGI states that have been funded through RGGI dollars. And it allowed them to meet a wide array of fiscal and social and environmental policy goals, including, obviously, efficiency being the big one, both in order to mitigate the cost impacts of the program, but also allow customers to manage their energy use better. Addressing budget challenges, as Miles was mentioning, in some states, some of the money has been used in some years to help with the general fund within those states. Some have targeted it towards low-income energy consumers. Money has been used to restore wetlands and other things that create ancillary greenhouse gas reductions. Investments in various advanced technologies and into municipalities and businesses to improve their own cost scenario by investing in efficiency and renewables. Next slide, Miles. And how that money is used affects their economic impacts. The energy efficiency investments have a strong positive economic impact because not only does it ultimately reduce consumption, particularly for those that are participating in the program, over time as that reduction in consumption takes hold, you're lowering the demand for electricity, which suppresses prices for everyone that's purchasing electricity. And ultimately keeps these impacts within the electric sector. The investments in energy efficiency have sort of a double whammy effect in the economy. One is most of that money is spent within the states. So a portion of that investment in our economic model is money that flows out of the states. For example, where appliances or light bulbs are manufactured outside the RGGI states. So some of that investment goes outside the states. But the biggest portion of that investment is associated with activity within the states, labor to conduct energy audits, to install energy efficiency measures, insulation, windows, etc. So there's a big chunk that stays within the states. But on the other hand, the reduction in cost for electricity to consumers is effectively additional disposable income in consumers' pockets, and that has a rippling effect throughout the economy. But other ways the money was spent, whether it's direct customer bill assistance, paying for educators and job trainers, that also is a good direct investment in the state's economies. Next slide, Miles. This might be the last one. Oh, nope, but we did already talk about this. This is the jobs are created. They reflect some temporary jobs, some longer-term jobs, and you can imagine the types of jobs they are given the way the money was spent. And then the final slide, nope, this is not the final slide. This is just pointing out what I already discussed again, that in the Northeast, and this doesn't necessarily translate to other regions, but in the Northeast, there's positive economic impacts associated with less money being spent for the underlying fuel for electricity generation going outside the region. And I promise this is the last one. So these are just a couple of points, and I'll be happy in the Q&A to talk about more. When you look at administration of the RGGI program, I think there's a huge amount that if for those states that are thinking, does it make sense to join a multi-state or a regional program and or to do mass-based programs, there's a lot of stuff to draw from RGGI with respect to those things. The multi-state program has clearly increased the options and flexibility for compliance and decreased compliance costs compared to if every single state administered its own individual program. But in the meantime, while coordinating across the regions, the states had to go through a regional stakeholder process, both in the initial design and the comprehensive review in 2012, but they then had to take the results to their individual state processes and determine how do we want to use the money, what tweaks do we want to make to the administration based upon our own state goals. So states preserved their authority, but by joining together and doing things on a multi-state basis, had these administrative and market efficiency benefits. Doing everything administratively at a single entity, it's based in New York City, it's called RGGI Inc. There's only several employees. There's money spent on consultants to administer auctions and monitor the market, but it's a teeny fraction of the overall revenues created by the program, and it's very efficient compared to individual state implementation. And then ultimately, retaining the allowance proceeds allowed states to reinvest and use the money to achieve a wide array of public policy benefits. I know when RGGI was starting, being part of it at the time, that there was, like I said, when the announcement was first made by the New York governor and the invitation to other states to join RGGI, I think most of us in the region were saying this will never happen. You know, the states can't agree. we don't even like New York and Massachusetts, let alone want to agree to a program with them, set a cap, figure out how to allocate the allowances. So there were a lot of things that looked like it was going to be impossible, and the biggest takeaway that I see from reviewing administration of the program is this is something that can work. For states that would want to take advantage of this type of mechanism for the Clean Power Plan, actually getting there is a lot easier than you might think at the outset, and that's I think a fairly key lesson to learn with respect to the Clean Power Plan. So apologize for going through this too long and with too many slides, but why don't I stop there and we'll listen to Jonas and then look forward to questions.
All right, thanks. Paul, I think one of the things that I definitely got from that was the idea that as long as we don't talk about baseball in our governing documents, we could make different states, even New York and Massachusetts, talk to one another. There was a bunch of stuff in what you talked about, particularly some of the stuff that you had on slide 13 with some of the benefits going to out-of-region fossil fuel payments. And maybe during Q&A, if we have time, I'm going to come back to that and see if we can just look at how that looks if you're Ohio or Pennsylvania or some of the folks who are on the input side of the fuel economic question algorithm there. Sure. But let's turn things over for a sec before we flip into that. Jonas, are you there?
I'm here.
Jonas, I wonder if you'd walk through a little bit of your perspective on what the lessons learned are from this approach. When you first brought me the idea about common elements, I've told people that I felt the same way I felt the first time I heard Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirit, which is very good. That it sounded really good to me, but I had a lot of questions about how it would work and what is this a real thing? And one of the reasons why I think we keep coming back to it is that RGGI kind of looks a little bit like a common elements approach. And I wonder if, as you've been kind of talking about common elements and other approaches in the Southeast and the Midwest, what does the stuff that RGGI's done mean for states that are looking at this for a common elements approach? Does it translate perfectly or not?
Yeah, good. I think all great questions. It's always a lot of pressure when you introduce me by comparing me to Nirvana, but I will do my best to be as exciting and earth-shattering here. So I think, talking about RGGI in the Clean Power Plan context, it means very different things to different people, right? So RGGI is an example of a multi-state CO2 trading program that works, right? That the power sector has pretty seamlessly incorporated into its decision-making processes. But then there are also, some states look at this and say, it took years to develop this thing. There are some administrative concerns, timeline concerns under the Clean Power Plan, political concerns, right? The term cap and trade means something different today than it meant when the RGGI conversation was first getting started. So what I think is useful when we're layering the RGGI example on top of the Clean Power Plan choices that are certainly available under the proposal and will almost certainly be still available under the final rule that we'll see next week. I think it's important to boil down what RGGI, like all the different aspects of RGGI, and what choices did the states make under RGGI because they were starting with a blank sheet of paper and they had a lot of very difficult choices to make. What choices were made because there were some values that the states designing RGGI wanted to achieve, and what choices kind of are the fundamental choices that are necessary to allow a multi-state market to evolve. So looking at it like that, so the choices that the RGGI states had to make. So the emissions target, big one, right? How do the allowances get into the marketplace? The choice that as Paul just described, the choice that all the states have made. Auctions, how do you deal with the revenue? Where do you put that revenue? Tracking and reporting requirements, and just simply getting a number of states with electricity sectors that look different from one another and politics that look different from one another to agree on all of those issues took quite a lot of time. Boiling it down though, so that this idea that we call common elements that the Great Plains Institute and Bipartisan Policy Center are describing very similarly. They call it trading ready. Really what it's doing is it's trying to strip away all the choices to get down to the core pieces that are necessary in order to allow a market to evolve under the Clean Power Plan. And we think, you know, when you strip away a lot of the layers of RGGI, what you end up with is each state adopted legislation that defined compliance instruments the same way, defined what the tracking and reporting requirements were the same way. You know, and RGGI, of course, decided to use the entity called RGGI Inc. to facilitate a lot of this. That's not necessary under the Clean Power Plan to do, but having the common instrument defined in the same way in multiple states is the key to allowing a multi-state market to evolve. That's the crux of the RGGI program, and that we think will be certainly a viable option under the Clean Power Plan. If states would not have to negotiate with one another in order to get there, especially just to use the simplest example, a mass-based program that says, you know, each individual unit emitting CO2 emissions, you know, that falls in the category of existing sources as defined under Section 111D, you know, would have a compliance obligation. So states divvy up those compliance obligations. In order to meet that compliance obligation, the units have a lot of choices, including the ability to submit allowances that represent a ton of CO2. So defining that instrument, allowing that as a potential compliance strategy without, you know, going any further as far as endorsing a cap and trade program or trying to, you know, make a lot of the difficult choices to design a specific market and implement it. And telling the entities how do you ensure that that's a good compliance instrument. So the tracking program, making sure it's not being used elsewhere, making sure it meets the definition that's in the state plan. Those are the core pieces of common elements, and the EPA will have made what I presume was one of the most difficult choices that the RGGI states had to struggle with at the beginning, which is what's the cap. The EPA state targets are going to define that for the states. So that takes one of these difficult issues off the table. Lessons learned from RGGI, right? So whether it's a program looks exactly like RGGI or whether it's a program that is boiled down to just the bare minimum, like the common elements idea that we describe in a policy brief we issued a couple of months ago. First off, pricing carbon. Pricing carbon in the electricity sector on a multi-state basis, I think is, first off, that's an important lesson to look at. I think the point that Paul emphasized towards the end there, how that carbon pricing mechanism interacts with ISOs and RTOs is certainly an important aspect that other states are looking to the RGGI model to understand, I believe. And also, I don't think this is something that that the RGGI states initially intended, but they designed a program that allowed states to enter and exit the marketplace. We know now with New Jersey deciding to exit the RGGI market that it's possible to have this market-based system have one participant change its mind, start doing something else, and the market still continued and didn't disrupt the RTO ISO dispatch system. So I think all of those are important. I think there are also some questions going forward. RGGI covers the entire, all of the CO2 emitting fossil fuel units within the states, including new natural gas and existing natural gas. Presumably, the EPA is going to allow the RGGI states in California and others that want to incorporate new natural gas into a market-based system to comply with the Clean Power Plan to do so, but there may be a lot of other states that don't want to bring new natural gas in, for example. So there may be some of those choices that some states make, and certainly that the RGGI states have already made, and presumably will want to see that choice implemented in whatever the future plans go forward that may affect which states are able to interact with each other through a market-based mechanism. And then, of course, RGGI will presumably need to think about whether to accept allowances coming from some of these other states that haven't officially joined the RGGI system. I can't speak at all to that choice, but it seems like that's probably going to be one of the issues that is on the table after we see the final rule. For the sake of moving quickly to questions, we only have 15 minutes. I'll end there. I'm happy to talk about any more of that in detail, but I certainly appreciated Paul's presentation and want to make sure we have enough time to answer questions about that.
Jonas, that's rad. And I definitely do have a couple questions that are going to be in the bullpen in a sec for y'all. For those of you guys on the webcast, if you do have questions, I've got a couple 3 in here already, and we'll do those, and we'll do a couple as well from here at the NARUC HQ under the volcano. But if you have more, go ahead and throw them in the questions box, and we'll put through as many as we can. I've got a couple 3 here that are absolutely awesome already. Let me start with a sort of a 1-2 pitch at you, Paul. I mentioned that I was going to come back to this kind of question of, like, if you draw your fence line at the RGGI states and do an economic analysis of the costs and benefits, there's money that doesn't flow out to a broader ecosystem, but if you, or a broader group of states, but if you draw the line in a larger way that accommodates some of those inputs and outputs, and I think I mentioned Ohio and PA as potential fuel producing states that are now not seeing this. How does that change the economic picture? Basically, my question is, if I am a non-RGGI participant state like PA, and I'm sitting next to RGGI, what is the economic effect for me? Is it mostly effects on power prices and non-sale revenue losses without some of the economic benefits of fuel savings, because some of that fuel is coming from my state too? Or are there lessons for non-participants from that piece of it, the calculus, if you look at it not from through the lens of the participating states, but from the lens of the non-participating states?
Yeah, it's a great question, Miles. And of course, being the geek that I am, I'm not going to be willing to tell you I know what the answer is. But ultimately, I think when we looked at the analysis for the RGGI states, and we looked at the diversity of ways in which, number one, states spent the money in different ways, and number two, it had different impacts within their wholesale market regions. All of the New England states are part of RGGI, but only 2 of the PJM states are part of RGGI. So the effect of those 2 states on the impact on electricity prices was muted in PJM, and those states spent the money in very different ways than New York and the New England states did. And so there's a wide range, like there's a pretty broad palette of ways in which all of these factors affect the end in terms of economic impact. So I would say that we highlight the benefit for the RGGI states with respect to not exporting fossil fuel dollars. But that's, when you look at it, that's one piece of the overall impact on the economic results. And I don't know whether it's a significant piece or not. It's $1.3 billion that's not going out of the state. But on the other hand, I can guarantee you that virtually every light bulb, more efficient appliance, refrigerator, dishwasher is also manufactured outside the RGGI state. So what we didn't actually try to tally was, yes, 1.3 billion is not going out of the RGGI states to other states, so that's a transfer. But then there is a new transfer where there's additional money going outside to different states from the RGGI states as a result of the way the states use the money. So that's part of the answer to your question about the impact on outside RGGI, the states outside RGGI compared to inside. If you were to look at what would the impact be if a state like Pennsylvania were to join RGGI, what would the economic impact be there? Because it would be losing revenues associated with production of fossil fuels to some extent. And if they turned around and spent the money on energy efficiency, that might be an offsetting impact. But there are sort of, I think, too many factors built into the relationship between different sectors of the economy and how that money flows through, that gives and takes flow through to be able to really guess what the impact might be. Overall, I would expect that if you were to draw a circle around the United States and say, here's the United States program to control emissions of carbon, and look at all the flows through the economy, there's likely to be some winners and some losers. In the end, I think, sort of like the results with the RGGI states, nothing's going to be big on either side if you were to look at a program that's roughly equivalent to what the RGGI states have done. But still, you would probably expect some on the positive and some on the negative side of the ledger.
All right. Good point. I also remember what you said about how it was not meant to be a economic stimulus program, which makes me feel like if you're suppressing your purchases of out-of-state fuel, if you're looking at this, if that's a large contributor to the benefits, if you draw that broader circle around more states, then you start drawing the circle to include some of those states that are not making those revenues from selling it to New England. So the benefit to expense ratio just looks different. But I hear what you're saying. It's hard. Let me move just a little bit down the line. Jonas, one of the questions that came in has to go to this question about like common elements. Most of the states that you've been talking to about common elements are in states where vertical integration occurs, or in states where there's vertical integration in organized markets, like in MISO or the like. So how realistic does a RGGI style multi-state mechanism look for states that are not in those unbundled wholesale markets, and how does common elements work in a place in a context where what's the difference that would allow y'all to be talking about common elements in a way that works in places like the Southeast and that makes conceptual sense in places like the Midwest? And is there a difference between that and how RGGI looks and works?
Yeah, good question. First off, I think one of the commonalities between the states where we interact with states really across the country, so it's not just the vertically integrated states. We do spend a lot more time focused on the Southeast than elsewhere. One of the aspects of the common elements approach that I think does make it conceptually attractive to states, regardless of the structure of the electricity system, is the ability to deal with some of the administrative and political hurdles of gaining the benefits of trade without state, certainly governors being in the position of saying that they are explicitly designing a cap and trade program, so allowing the decision to rest at the generator level as opposed to policymakers making a number of choices about how, where, and how and where trading can take place and where the revenue would be allocated within the state. I actually think that the common elements strategy could work quite well where you don't have the vertically integrated systems, where you have the large utilities and they have a number of choices across their service territory, the units that they are operating, and they can average across that. There may be a lot more choices available to them than would be available to the smaller merchant generators that may have, the co-ops that may have 1 or 2 units, or a small number of units. If they have a clearly defined compliance obligation, so if the obligation is divvied up to the units that are covered by 111D, and they have access to a market through a market that's evolved based on this common element strategy, then those individual operators may have access to a much broader array of low-cost compliance strategies instead of just having to look across their potentially small fleet.
Awesome answer. Let me throw one out from Colorado, Drew Bolin. Hi, Drew. Nice to see your name. Has a really good one that's spicy and requires some rampant speculation, Paul. Is New Jersey considering rejoining RGGI?
That's a funny question, because I got that question two days ago from someone else. We have heard, I have heard, and this is third hand, and it's rampant speculation, but I have heard through the grapevine that various states are considering, do we want to create a system like RGGI? Do we want to join RGGI? And it doesn't have to be contiguous states, so this isn't limited to those that either were in RGGI or are touching RGGI. But I have not heard anything definitive about New Jersey considering rejoining RGGI at all. And if you look at, if you think about the political situation, it would be a rather difficult thing for candidate Christie to endorse at this point in time, and it would be something that that you would think would have to take some time anyway. The thing I noticed about this is that for a state like New Jersey, where it is, they will eventually have to come up with some way of complying with the Clean Power Plan. And you would think, given the fact that they have laws and regulations on the books and administrative mechanisms and entities within the relevant agencies within the states that are familiar with the program and would be able to implement it relatively quickly, it gives them some flexibility to have that there as a potential compliance option, even if in the end, for other reasons, they decide not to. But that's a long-winded, that is speculation. I don't have any inside information on that.
It's a shame, but thank you for playing ball. Jonas, do you want to add anything?
I have no insights regarding New Jersey's plans for RGGI. If these kind of bottom-up market approaches do take place, though, I mean, there could be another option for New Jersey, like any other state, to allow their entities to access markets that have evolved under the Clean Power Plan without having to formally rejoin RGGI.
I've got more questions than we're going to have time to answer, I'm afraid. So there's a couple folks out there who may not get their opportunities, and I'm sorry about that. Let me throw out Andrew Kell from Wisconsin. Always has brilliant questions, and I think this probably starts with Paul and also you probably have a bite at this apple too, Jonas. How do RECs fit into these multi-state schemes where you're primarily trading CO2? Are they the same things? Are they cousins? Are they different but running alongside? Is it a canoe outrigger or is it a central piece of the hull?
Funny, I don't. So in most of the RGGI states, there's also renewable portfolio standards, and there's no linking between the two at all, other than the fact that when I am a renewable generator and I'm making an offer into the wholesale market, I not only do not have to add an incremental cost for carbon, but I also am able to reduce my price, assuming the benefit of the REC that I'll get from my operation. That puts it in a competitive advantage position relative to the fossil generator that doesn't have the decrement associated with renewable generation, but also has the incremental cost associated with having to purchase an allowance. So there's no administrative or functional relationship between RECs and allowances in the markets where RGGI is operating, but obviously from the standpoint of competition in the wholesale markets, both of them accrue to the advantage of the renewable generator relative to competitors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I would just say a couple of things. First off, the proposal made it clear that RECs as an instrument, the renewable energy credit, would not be able to directly be used as compliance under the Clean Power Plan. Under a rate-based system, it could be possible that a renewable energy facility has something to sell on the rate-based aspect and also have a renewable energy credit available to sell. Under a mass-based program, you would presumably, if you're counting the tons coming out of the smokestack, if the renewable energy facility is reducing the amount of tons coming out of a smokestack, then that's incorporated into the market base and the price. But those facilities may still have renewable energy credits to operate. The choice for states to continue operating renewable energy credits markets or renewable portfolio standards, I think it's completely distinct. It should be seen as a separate policy issue than the Clean Power Plan.
There's one more question which we're going to go about a minute over in order to cover it, but Bill Chambliss from Virginia always asks the best questions, and I can't resist. So folks, please indulge me for an extra 60 seconds today. His question basically refers back to the caps that are related to RGGI. Did RGGI set the caps, or were there any states that established caps and then applied RGGI as a kind of a coming back around to it? Or was the cap inherent as part of joining, as part of the coming into each state's individual cap, inherent as part of coming into RGGI?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to answer that is once the governors made the commitment on behalf of the RGGI states and sent out their marshals to enter into this negotiation and design the program, that there was a process whereby the states together and jointly with stakeholder processes thought through what they thought the cap should be relative to historical emissions. The states then had to agree, how do we divide that cap amongst the states? And they followed loosely the same basis as the decision on where to set the cap. So there wasn't any pre-existing cap in the RGGI states that they walked in with. It was fully deliberated as part of the common RGGI stakeholder process, and then the negotiation amongst states.
All right, that siren you hear in the background means that my evil ways have finally caught up to me, and at any moment I'll be yanked away from this computer. With that, I hope that all of y'all will join me in thanking our speakers today, Jonas Monast from Duke University's Nicholas Institute, and Paul Hibbard from the Analysis Group. This was really great. Join us again. We'll continue doing these brown bag broadcasts only through the summer. We've got three more to do. We're going to be talking with the FERC about siting. We're going to be talking with folks in the heartland states about new transmission technologies and how those help us with cost allocation and planning problems that we've got, and lots of other fun stuff. So do come back next Friday and in the future. With that, I'm going to call this webcast to a close. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have to go home, but you can't sleep here. Bye-bye now.